Listen closely, my friends, to a story from long ago about a king who forgot that some things are too sacred to touch. If you're watching this video, please like, subscribe to the channel, and tell me in the comments where you're watching my folktale story from. I want to know how far it has traveled. In the town of Oba, people woke up every morning to the sound of drums and the smell of fresh bread. Right in the middle of their market stood a huge tree called the Juju tree. This tree was as thick as 10 men holding hands and as tall as a palace. The tree was very special. People would bring kola nuts and pour palm wine at its roots every day. Mothers would grab their children's hands when they got too close and say, "Don't touch that tree, child. The spirits live inside it." Old people would bow their heads when they walked past. Even the bravest hunters would lower their voices near the tree. Everyone knew that powerful spirits slept inside its trunk, and they had been there since the beginning of time. The tree's bark was dark and rough, and its branches reached up to the clouds. When the wind blew, the leaves would whisper secrets that only the wise could understand. Birds never built nests in its branches, and even the boldest monkeys stayed away. This was no ordinary tree. This was a tree that connected the world of the living with the world of the spirits. King Okoro sat on his beautiful throne made of coral beads and gold. He owned more farms than he could count, thousands of cattle, and many servants who obeyed his every word. His palace was the biggest in all the land. But something was wrong with the king's heart. Even though he had everything a man could want, he felt empty inside, like a water pot with a big hole in the bottom. No matter how much he poured in, it would never stay full. Every morning, King Okoro would wake up wanting people to tell him how great he was. Every night, he would go to sleep thinking about how he could prove he was better than everyone else. "I am the greatest king," he would tell himself in the mirror. But deep down, he wasn't sure. This made him angry and restless. One morning, the king stood on his balcony and looked out at his kingdom. He saw the busy market, the happy people, and right in the center, the mighty Juju tree that everyone respected. "I will show them," he said to himself, clenching his fists. "I will prove that I am the greatest in every single way possible." The king called his wise chiefs to the palace. These were old men who had served his father and his father's father. They came walking slowly with their carved wooden sticks and long, flowing robes. The queen mother, Mamenkem, was there too. She was a gentle woman with kind eyes and a soft voice. "My son," she said carefully, "true greatness doesn't need to make noise. It speaks quietly, like the morning dew." The royal diviner, the man who could see the future, threw his cowrie shells on the floor and studied them carefully. His face became worried. "Great king," he said, shaking his gray head, "the shells show danger. You must avoid the sacred things. Some powers are not meant to be tested." But King Okoro didn't want to hear any of this. He waved his hand in the air like he was shooing away flies. "You old men worry too much," he laughed. Then he clapped his hands loudly and called for his drummers to come and play happy music. The wise men looked at each other with worried faces. They had seen this kind of pride before, and they knew it never ended well. The next morning, King Okoro stepped out onto his palace balcony where everyone in the market could see him. His voice was so loud it seemed to shake the very ground. "My people," he shouted, spreading his arms wide. "Let us hold the greatest festival this land has ever seen." The crowd below stopped what they were doing and looked up at their king. He looked magnificent in his bright red robes and golden crown. "We will have games of strength," the king announced. "The strongest men will compete to show their power. We will have a parade of wealth, where everyone can see the riches of our kingdom. And we will have a contest to see which man is the most handsome." The people murmured with excitement. Festivals were always fun, with dancing and singing and plenty of food. But then the king said something that made everyone gasp. "And we will also see whose wife is the most beautiful woman in all the land." Suddenly, the air felt different. This was not the kind of contest that wise people held. The Juju tree, which had been perfectly still in the calm morning air, began to rustle its leaves. But there was no wind at all. Town criers ran through every street, banging their gongs and shouting the news. Come one, come all. The king calls for a great tournament of strength. Soon, wrestlers began arriving from 9 different villages. These were big, powerful men who rubbed sand on their arms to get a better grip on their opponents. They practiced by wrestling with each other in the dust outside the town. Men who lifted heavy stones came too, rolling boulders that were as big as goats' heads. They would grunt and strain, showing off their muscles to anyone who would watch. The spear throwers set up targets made of clay pots far away and practiced hitting them with perfect aim. Their spears whistled through the air like angry birds. King Okoro watched all these preparations from his balcony, and his smile grew bigger and bigger. He was hungry for the cheers and praise that would come during the contests. Finally, he thought to himself, everyone will see that I am truly the greatest king who ever lived. But down in the market, by the roots of the juju tree, a young boy was watching everything with worried eyes. This boy's name was Ibuka, and he was not like the other children. While they played loud games and ran around the market, Ibuka preferred to sit quietly by the juju tree and draw pictures in the dust with a stick. Ibuka was thin and not very tall, but his eyes were bright and intelligent. He sold groundnuts for his mother to help buy food for their small family. He talked less than other children, but he listened much more. Ibuka loved the juju tree like it was his best friend. Every day after selling groundnuts, he would sit in its shade and feel peaceful. The tree made him feel safe and protected. Sometimes, when the sun went down and the market became quiet, Ibuka could hear a deep humming sound coming from inside the tree's trunk. It was like the tree was singing a very low, very old song. Other people couldn't hear this humming, but Ibuka could. And lately, the humming sounded different. It sounded worried, like the tree was trying to warn him about something dangerous that was coming. Ibuka didn't understand what the warning meant yet, but he trusted the tree completely. He had a feeling that something bad was going to happen. The day of the wrestling contest arrived, and the town square was packed with excited people. Men sang and stomped their feet, raising clouds of dust that sparkled in the sunlight. The wrestlers faced each other, grappling and twisting and throwing each other to the ground with loud thumps. The crowd cheered every time someone hit the dust. But Ibuka noticed something strange. The king's secret guards were whispering in the ear of the king's champion wrestler. They were giving him special instructions that nobody else could hear. When the king's champion faced his opponents, he seemed to know exactly what moves they would make before they made them. He threw 3 strong men to the ground, one after another, and then bowed deeply to the king. King Okoro jumped up from his throne and raised both hands in the air. I am the strongest king in the world, he shouted. Because my champion is the strongest, that makes me the strongest too. The crowd cheered, but some of the old men frowned. They knew that a king's strength should come from wisdom and kindness, not from the muscles of other men. But the king didn't notice their frowns. He was too busy enjoying the sound of people clapping for him. Next came the stone lifting contest. A huge boulder sat in the middle of the square, as big as a fat goat and probably twice as heavy. One by one, strong men tried to lift the stone. They grunted and groaned and turned red in the face, but the stone wouldn't budge even a little bit. Then the king's champion stepped forward. The crowd watched as he bent down and, with what looked like amazing strength, lifted the heavy stone high above his head. Everyone cheered and applauded, amazed by this show of power. But Ibuka's sharp eyes noticed something that others missed. Under the man's wrapper, he could see the edge of a special leather belt with ropes attached to it. The champion wasn't really lifting the stone by himself. He had a secret device helping him do it. He was cheating, and the king either knew about it or didn't care to find out. Ibuka bit his lip and felt worried. If the king was willing to cheat in contests, what else might he be willing to do? The crowd kept cheering, but Ibuka noticed that some of the older, wiser people were beginning to frown and whisper to each other. After all the younger men had competed, an old wrestler with white hair and a bent back stepped forward. His muscles were not as big as they used to be, but his eyes were clear and intelligent. Great king, the old man said in a voice that carried across the whole square, I have lived many years, and I have learned something important. True strength is not only found in a man's arms and back. Real strength also lives in truth and honesty. The crowd became very quiet. Everyone knew that this old wrestler had been famous for his fairness and wisdom when he was young. But King Okoro just laughed loudly and pulled out a small leather bag filled with cowrie shells, which were used as money. He tossed the bag to the old wrestler and said, "Here, old man. Take this payment and keep your wise words to yourself." The old wrestler caught the bag and bowed politely, but anyone who looked closely could see that his eyes were filled with sadness. He had tried to give the king good advice, but the king had treated his wisdom like something that could be bought and silenced. As the old man walked away, the leaves of the juju tree began to tremble and shake, even though the air was perfectly still. The next morning, King Okoro announced the second contest. "Tomorrow we will hold the greatest parade of wealth that anyone has ever seen," he declared. All through the day, his servants worked hard to prepare. They polished ivory elephant tusks until they gleamed like the moon. They cleaned golden bracelets and necklaces until they shone like the sun. They brushed the cattle and tied bright red cloth around their horns. The servants lined up baskets full of cowrie shells, strings of beautiful coral beads, and mirrors that caught the light and threw it back in dazzling patterns. King Okoro watched all these preparations, and his smile grew wider and wider. He could already imagine himself riding high above the crowd, showing off all his riches while people cheered and told him how wonderful he was. The Queen Mother, Mamankem, watched her son getting more and more excited about the parade. She sighed deeply because she knew that true wealth came from having a good heart and caring for your people, not from showing off gold and jewels. But the king was too excited to notice his mother's worried face. All he could think about was the praise he would receive tomorrow. The wealth parade moved through the streets like a glittering river. There were servants carrying baskets overflowing with cowrie shells that clicked and rattled as they walked. Men held up long strings of red coral beads that looked like drops of blood caught in sunlight. Women walking alongside the parade let out high, joyful calls called ululations that rang through the air like music. Children danced and laughed, caught up in the excitement of seeing so many beautiful things. King Okoro rode on a special high stool that was carried by 4 of his strongest servants. Every few steps, he would raise his arms and shout, "Look at me! I am the richest king in all the world." The mirrors that his servants carried flashed and sparkled, throwing rainbow lights on the walls of houses and into people's eyes. The ivory tusks gleamed white and smooth, and the golden jewelry seemed to hold pieces of the sun itself. The crowd was impressed by all this wealth and beauty. They clapped and cheered, and this made the king very happy. But not everyone in the crowd was smiling. Some of the wisest people remembered that true riches meant having enough food for everyone and making sure that no one went to bed hungry. As the magnificent parade reached the city gate, an old woman sat in the dust with a sick child in her arms. She was a widow with no husband to help her and no money to buy medicine. "Please, great king," she called out in a weak voice, holding up her thin hand. "My child is very sick. Do you have even one small coin or some medicine that could help us?" But the king's servants, who were carrying his high stool, saw the poor woman and quickly walked to the other side of the road. They lifted the stool even higher so that the king wouldn't have to look down and see the poverty below. King Okoro never even noticed the sick child or the desperate mother. But Ibuka, who was following the parade with the other children, stopped when he saw the widow. Without saying a word, he took the water calabash that hung from his shoulder and gently gave the sick child a drink of cool, clean water. Queen Mother Mamankem, who was walking near the back of the parade, saw what Ibuka did. She pressed her lips together tightly and shook her head sadly. A poor boy who sold groundnuts had shown more kindness than the richest king in the land. That night, when the celebration was over and the town was quiet, the royal diviner went to his shrine to pray and seek wisdom from the spirits. He drew white chalk marks on the floor in special patterns and lit sweet-smelling incense. Then he threw his cowrie shells again and again, reading the messages they gave him. Finally, he called for Queen Mother Mamankem to come and hear what he had learned. "Great Queen Mother," he said solemnly, "pride is like climbing a very tall palm tree without using a rope to keep you safe. The higher you climb, the farther you will fall when you lose your grip. Mamenkem sat down heavily and put her face in her hands. How can we help my son before it's too late? She asked. The diviner shook his head sadly. Only the king's own heart can choose whether to step on solid ground or keep climbing toward danger. No one else can make that choice for him. He gathered up his cowrie shells and looked at them one more time. They all showed the same thing: great danger was gathering around the sacred juju tree, and the king was walking straight toward it. The next morning, King Okoro announced the strangest contest yet. Today we will hold a beauty contest, but only for men, he cried from his balcony. Let the most handsome men come forward and show their beauty. This was very unusual. Beauty contests were normally for women, not men. But the king wanted to prove that he was the best at everything, even being handsome. Men from all over the kingdom began to arrive. They braided their hair with colorful beads and oiled their beards until they shone. They wore their finest wrappers made of the most beautiful cloth they could find. The judges were men who knew about beauty, barbers who cut hair, tailors who made fine clothes, and traveling traders who had seen people from many different lands. The crowd buzzed with excitement and curiosity. They had never seen anything like this before. Some people thought it was funny, but others felt uncomfortable. There was something about this contest that didn't feel right. Ibuka sat by his beloved juju tree and watched the preparations with growing worry. The tree's humming had become stronger and more urgent, like it was trying harder and harder to warn everyone about something terrible that was coming. The men who came to compete were truly handsome. A hunter from the western villages arrived wearing bright feathers in his cap and a necklace made from the claws of a leopard he had killed. A drummer from the north wore a magnificent blue turban with silver threads woven through it that sparkled when he moved. His beard was perfectly trimmed, and his smile was bright and friendly. A fisherman came from the great river, wearing a necklace made from smooth, round shells that looked like tiny moons. His skin was dark and smooth from spending his days in the sun and water. Each man was handsome in his own way. The judges walked around them carefully, comparing their smiles, their strong shoulders, and the graceful way they moved. The crowd watched with interest as the judges whispered to each other and pointed at different contestants. It looked like the drummer with the blue turban might win because of his bright, intelligent eyes and his neatly trimmed beard. King Okoro stood on his balcony watching everything like a hawk watches a mouse. His eyes were narrow and his jaw was tight. He was getting ready to make sure that he would win this contest too, no matter what the judges decided. The judges spent a long time making their decision. They walked back and forth between the contestants, talking quietly to each other and nodding their heads. Finally, it looked like they were going to choose the drummer with the blue turban. He had the brightest eyes, the neatest beard, and the most graceful way of moving. But just as the judges opened their mouths to announce their decision, King Okoro suddenly stood up and began laughing very loudly, too loudly, like someone who is nervous. "Wait," he boomed in a voice that echoed off the walls of the houses. "You have forgotten someone very important." Before anyone could say anything, the king jumped down from his balcony and strode into the middle of the contest area. "No man in this kingdom is more handsome than me," he declared, puffing out his chest and lifting his chin high in the air. He forced the poor drummer to kneel down in front of him, then grabbed the victory staff out of the judge's hands and gave it to himself. The crowd clapped, but their applause was weak and uncertain. Even children could tell that this wasn't fair. The elders looked away because they were ashamed of their king's behavior. But King Okoro wasn't finished yet. The next day, he announced an even stranger contest. "Now we will see which man in my kingdom has married the most beautiful wife," he declared. "Bring your wives forward, and let us judge their beauty." This made many people very uncomfortable. In their culture, a woman's beauty was something private and precious, not something to be judged in public like the size of a yam or the speed of a horse. But the king had spoken, so men began bringing their wives forward. The women walked with dignity and pride, their heads held high and their finest wrappers flowing around them like colorful rivers. The judges this time were different. They were wise women who understood that true beauty came from kindness, gentle speech, and clear, honest eyes, not just from a pretty face. As they looked at all the women, one stood out from all the rest. She was the wife of a humble farmer, and she didn't wear gold or fancy beads. But when she smiled, it was like cool water after a long, hot day. When she spoke, her voice was soft and sweet. When she looked at people, her eyes were full of warmth and understanding. The crowd began to murmur with approval. Everyone could see that this farmer's wife had a special kind of beauty that came from having a good heart. When King Okoro heard the crowd favoring the farmer's wife, his face became tight and angry like a knot in a rope. He snapped his fingers loudly, and immediately his guards lifted his own queen onto the stage. She was covered with bright coral jewelry and her face was painted with expensive gold powder that shimmered in the sunlight. "Look," the king shouted, spreading his arms wide. "My queen is clearly the most beautiful woman in all the land. How could you even think of choosing anyone else?" The judges looked at each other nervously. They could see that the king was angry and might punish them if they didn't agree with him. Slowly and reluctantly, they nodded their heads and pointed to the queen as the winner. But everyone in the crowd knew this wasn't fair. The farmer's wife had won with her natural beauty and kind heart, not with expensive jewelry and gold paint. The poor farmer looked down at his feet, too scared to say anything. His wife put her hand gently on his arm to comfort him. In the crowd, people began whispering to each other about how their king was cheating in every single contest. They were losing respect for him, and this made the wise elders very worried about what might happen next. That night, when the market was quiet and most people had gone to bed, Ibuka sat by the juju tree with his knees pulled up to his chest. He was more worried than he had ever been in his life. The tree's humming was now so loud and urgent that he was surprised other people couldn't hear it too. As he listened carefully to the deep sound coming from the tree's trunk, he began to hear actual words hidden in the humming. "Pride burns like fire. Touch not the sacred things. Danger comes with the morning sun." Ibuka shivered even though the night was warm. He jumped up and ran as fast as he could to the palace, where he asked to speak with Queen Mother Mamankem. When he told her what he had heard, she took his small hands in her larger ones and looked into his frightened eyes. "I believe you, child," she said softly. "The spirits speak to those who have pure hearts and listen carefully. But I fear my son's pride has made him deaf to all warnings, even from the spirit world." She held Ibuka's hand tightly and they both looked out the window toward the sacred tree, knowing that tomorrow would bring great danger. When the sun rose the next morning, King Okoro stood before the juju tree holding his finest axe. The axe blade gleamed in the early light, sharp and deadly. His voice rang out across the silent market square, "People of Oba. I have defeated all men in contests of strength. I have shown that I am the richest king who ever lived. I have proven that I am the most handsome man in the kingdom." The crowd gathered around, but instead of cheering, they stood in frightened silence. "Now," the king continued, raising his axe high above his head, "I will defeat the spirits themselves. I will cut down this tree with my own hands and show everyone that I am greater than any power in heaven or earth." The market went so quiet that you could hear a pin drop on the ground. Even the goats stopped chewing their food. Even the chickens stopped clucking. Everyone knew that what the king was planning to do was the most dangerous thing possible. The juju tree was not just any tree, it was the home of powerful spirits who had been there since the beginning of time. But King Okoro's pride had grown so big that it filled up his whole heart, leaving no room for wisdom or fear. As soon as the king finished speaking, the elders fell to their knees in the dust and began begging him to stop. "Great king, please," they cried. "Do not do this terrible thing. The spirits will be angry beyond all measure." The royal diviner ran forward, shaking his rattle so hard that his whole arm ached. "My king, I have seen the future in my cowrie shells. This will bring disaster to our whole kingdom." Queen Mother Mamankem stepped forward with tears streaming down her face. "My son," she said in a voice full of love and fear, "please do not step into a fire that you cannot see. Some things are too powerful and too sacred to challenge." But King Okoro lifted his chin high and refused to listen to any of them. His pride had become like a wall around his heart that no wise words could break through. I am the greatest king who ever lived, he shouted. No spirit, no tree, and no old superstition will stand in my way. Young Ibuka, standing near the tree, felt the earth under his feet growing cold. The very ground seemed to be preparing for something terrible to happen. All around the market, people held their breath and waited for disaster. King Okoro raised his sharp axe and brought it down hard on the bark of the sacred tree. The moment the blade touched the trunk, something horrible happened. Instead of clear tree sap, thick red liquid began flowing down the bark like a river of blood. The women in the crowd screamed and pulled their children close to their bodies. The drummers were so shocked that they dropped their drumsticks on the ground. Even the bravest hunters took steps backward in fear. But King Okoro just smirked and lifted his axe again. The sight of blood flowing from the tree should have warned him to stop, but his pride was stronger than his fear. You see, he called out to the frightened crowd. It bleeds like any ordinary tree. There is nothing magical about it. But everyone else could feel that something was terribly wrong. The air itself seemed to be getting thicker and harder to breathe. Birds flying overhead suddenly changed direction and flew away as fast as they could. The tree's blood kept flowing, staining the ground around its roots a dark red color. Ibuka pressed his hands to his ears, but he could still hear the tree crying out in pain and anger. The king raised his axe for the second strike. When it hit the tree trunk, the whole world seemed to shake. The ground rolled back and forth like a wave on the ocean. People lost their balance and fell down. Clay pots toppled over and cracked into pieces. Houses swayed back and forth like they were dancing. All the birds in the area suddenly flew up into the sky in a huge black cloud, cawing and shrieking in fear. Dogs howled. Goats bleated in terror. The sky began to grow dark even though the sun was still shining. It was as if a shadow was spreading across the land, but there were no clouds to make the shadow. King Okoro's hands began to shake as he held the axe, but his pride was still too strong to let him stop. He gritted his teeth and prepared for the third and final strike. I will not be defeated by a tree, he growled through clenched teeth. But all around him, people were crying and praying to their ancestors for protection. They knew that their king was about to do something that would bring punishment not just on himself, but on their whole town. The very air seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for the final disaster. King Okoro raised his axe for the third and final strike, but before the blade could touch the tree again, something incredible happened. The great Juju tree split open with a sound like thunder. The crack ran from the roots all the way up to the highest branches. From inside the hollow trunk, spirits poured out like water from a broken dam. Some looked like smoke, some looked like fire, and some looked like whirlwind. All of them were angry beyond description. The spirits wrapped around King Okoro in chains that were not made of metal, but of storm clouds and lightning. His guards, who had always been so brave and strong, suddenly froze like they had been turned into wooden statues. King Okoro tried to scream, but the sound was swallowed by the roaring of the spirits. They lifted him off the ground and began pulling him toward the hollow tree. I am the king, he cried. You cannot do this to me. But the spirits paid no attention to his royal title. With a terrible sound that was like the wind and the earthquake and the thunder all mixed together, they pulled the proud king into the hollow of the tree. Then, as suddenly as it had opened, the great tree closed again, trapping King Okoro inside forever. A deep, painful silence fell over the market square. It was the kind of quiet that hurts your ears and makes your heart feel heavy. Queen Mother Mamankem, with tears in her eyes, walked slowly to the tree and placed a white cloth at its roots as an offering of respect and sorrow. The royal diviner gathered the people together and taught them to plant 7 young trees in a circle around the great Juju tree. These would be a sign of their promise to always respect the sacred things. Every morning from that day forward, young Ibuka would come and water the new trees with clean water from the well. Children would bring songs instead of boasts, and flowers instead of demands. The people learned to honor their promises to each other. They began to take care of the poor and the sick. They remembered the lesson that the spirits had taught them in such a terrible way: true greatness is gentle and quiet, not loud and proud. And they never forgot that some things in this world are too sacred and too powerful to be challenged by human pride, no matter how great that person thinks they are. The juju tree still stands in the market of Oba today, reminding everyone who passes by to be humble and to respect the things that are greater than themselves. The story you have just heard is a beautiful African tale that teaches us to be humble and respect things that are sacred and more powerful than ourselves. I'm sharing this with you to wake your minds to the danger of pride and the importance of wisdom. If you were in King Okoro's place, what would you have done when the elders and your mother warned you about the sacred tree? Would you have listened to their wisdom, or would pride have made you deaf to good advice? I want to know your opinion because every story is like a candle that can light the path for someone else walking in darkness. Remember, true greatness comes from kindness, humility, and caring for others, not from showing off or proving you're better than everyone else. God bless you, and may wisdom guide your steps. Meanwhile, on the final screen, I am leaving you with one of the channel's most beloved folktales about courage and friendship. I am sure you'll love it. Thank you for staying with me until this moment.